cardboard boxes, the size of miniature houses, lined the hallway. Each one bore the scars of countless moves, their faded labels whispering of past lives. Ethan shouldered his way through the maze, the scent of packing peanuts clinging to the air. He liked the smell. It was the bittersweet aroma of new beginnings, a stark contrast to the stale, forgotten air of their old apartment. This house was different. It wasn't new, not by a long shot. 2 stories of weathered clapboard rose from a foundation that dipped slightly in the center. The windows, tall and narrow, seemed to watch him with an unsettling intensity. But Ethan, at 16, saw only potential. Here in this sprawling, slightly neglected house on the outskirts of town, he saw a chance to rewrite his story. The past year had been a blur of arguments and slammed doors. His parents, worn thin by the relentless pressure of the city, had craved a fresh start. Ethan, burdened by the weight of adolescence and the ever-present awareness of his parents' struggles, craved it too. So with a mix of apprehension and hope, they'd packed their lives into boxes and driven towards the unknown. The first few days were a whirlwind of unpacking and exploration. The house held a quiet charm, its rooms echoing with the whispers of a bygone era. Ethan found a dusty gramophone tucked away in a corner, its brass horn gleaming under a shaft of sunlight. He imagined the music that once filled these very walls, the laughter and conversation that had warmed them. The attic, however, remained a mystery. A heavy lock secured its entrance, its purpose unknown. His father, with a sigh that spoke of forgotten battles, promised to tackle it later. Ethan claimed a small room on the 2nd floor, nestled directly beneath the attic. It was a cozy space, the wallpaper adorned with faded floral patterns. At night, as he unpacked his meager collection of belongings, he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. It wasn't a malevolent presence, not exactly. More like a curious gaze, a weight on the back of his neck that made him glance over his shoulder more than once. But the room was empty, bathed in the warm glow of his desk lamp. Perhaps, he reasoned, it was just the strangeness of a new place, the shadows dancing on unfamiliar walls. He shrugged it off, attributing it to nerves and a healthy dose of teenage imagination. The days blurred into a monotonous routine of unpacking and settling in. The initial unease in his room faded with familiarity, replaced by a sense of quiet comfort. The attic door remained resolutely locked, a forgotten promise swallowed by the everyday rush. His parents, caught up in the logistics of starting new jobs, hadn't mentioned it again. One evening, as Ethan sat glued to his video game, the rhythmic buzzing of his phone startled him. A text message blinked on the screen. It was from his parents, a frantic string of words apologizing for a last-minute work obligation. They wouldn't be back until late, it read, urging him to lock up tight and eat something decent. A flicker of unease snaked through him. He'd never been left alone for an entire night before. The house, once charmingly eccentric, suddenly felt vast and unsettlingly quiet. Every creak of the floorboards, every groan of the settling house magnified his anxiety. He pictured shadowy figures lurking in the corners, unseen eyes watching him from beneath the furniture. The news had been filled with reports of petty thefts in the area lately, stories that fueled his paranoia. He meticulously checked all the doors and windows, the deadbolts a flimsy comfort against the phantoms of his imagination. He decided to sleep downstairs on the worn but familiar couch in the living room. The television provided a white noise that warred with the incessant whispering of his own anxieties. The hours crawled by. He kept the TV on a low volume, a desperate attempt to drown out the unsettling symphony of creaks and groans that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Sleep, when it finally came, was a fitful affair. He dreamt of eyes, red and glowing, peering down at him from the darkness above. He woke with a jolt, the first sliver of dawn filtering through the dusty blinds. Relief washed over him, a wave so potent it left him shaky. Perhaps, he thought, his overactive imagination had gotten the better of him. Weeks melted into months. The initial strangeness of the house faded, replaced by a comforting familiarity. The attic door remained resolutely unaddressed, a silent, forgotten promise. One night, as Ethan lay tucked under his covers, a familiar peace settled over him. Then a sound shattered the tranquility. A loud, jarring noise, a bizarre mix of a whinny and a hiss, echoed through the house. Ethan bolted upright, heart hammering against his ribs. Was it a dream? He closed his eyes, willing himself back to sleep. The sound came again, closer this time, sending shivers down his spine. Panic clawed at his throat. They didn't have any pets, and there were certainly no wild animals roaming the suburbs. Fear, sharp and primal, flooded his senses. He fumbled for his phone, the screen illuminating the room in a pale blue glow. He dialed his parents' number, his finger trembling as he waited. No answer. Probably asleep, he thought, trying to quell the rising panic. He forced himself to breathe, counting each shallow inhalation. He had to ignore it. Maybe it was just a stray cat, the sound distorted by the house's odd acoustics. He tried to settle back into his pillows, but sleep remained elusive. Finally exhausted and defeated, he decided to check on his parents. He crept out of bed, tiptoeing towards the door. With a deep breath, he cracked it open a sliver, peering into the darkness. The hallway was an inky abyss, the moonlight swallowed by the shadows. His heart hammered a frantic rhythm against his ribs. Then he saw it. Two glowing red orbs, like embers burning in the darkness. They weren't halfway down the hall, as he expected. They were impossibly high, fixed on the ceiling directly above him. He froze, a primal fear gripping him. As quickly as they appeared, the eyes vanished the moment he flicked on the light switch. Relief flooded him, momentarily washing away the terror. He blinked, adjusting his eyes to the sudden brightness. And then a new wave of fear crashed over him. In the pale glow of the light bulb, he saw it. The heavy lock on the attic door, the one that had been there since they moved in, was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through him. He hadn't heard anyone tampering with it. It had simply vanished. Terror propelled him forward. He had to reach his parents, warn them. His bare feet pounded against the cold wooden floorboards. He was halfway there when the lights flickered once, then plunged the house into complete darkness. The growl sounded again, right behind him. This time there was no mistaking the source. It was close. Very close. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he slowly turned around, dreading what he might see. There in the darkness stood a figure. It was tall, unnaturally so, its limbs long and spindly. The creature's skin was a sickly pale, almost translucent, and its eyes glowed a menacing red. Its mouth, a gaping maw filled with razor-sharp teeth, twisted into a grotesque smile. Ethan screamed, a sound that was swallowed by the oppressive darkness. He turned and ran, stumbling blindly through the house. He could hear the creature behind him, its heavy footsteps echoing through the halls. He had to find a way out, had to escape this nightmare. He burst through the front door, the cool night air hitting his face. He ran, his bare feet pounding against the pavement. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to get away. The streets were empty, the houses dark and silent. He felt utterly alone, trapped in a horror movie come to life. Suddenly, a hand grabbed his shoulder. Ethan let out a terrified yelp, spinning around to face his attacker. But it wasn't the creature. It was his father, his face etched with concern. Ethan collapsed into his father's arms, his body shaking with sobs. He tried to explain, his words coming out in a jumbled rush. His father listened, his expression growing more and more troubled. Together they walked back to the house, his father's arm around his shoulders. As they approached, Ethan's blood ran cold. The front door, the one he had just run through, was closed, locked. His father frowned, pulling out his keys. The lock clicked, and the door swung open. The house was quiet, undisturbed. There was no sign of the creature, no indication that anything was amiss. Ethan's father checked the attic, the heavy lock back in place, untouched. He searched the entire house, finding nothing out of the ordinary. Ethan watched, a growing sense of unease settling in his stomach. Had it all been in his head? A vivid, terrifying nightmare? Days passed, and life returned to normal. Ethan tried to push the memories of that night out of his mind, convincing himself that it had been a product of his overactive imagination. But sometimes in the dead of night he would wake up, sure he could hear the faint sound of scratching coming from the attic above. And sometimes, just before he drifted off to sleep, he would see a pair of glowing red eyes watching him from the darkness, waiting,